Hi everyone, and welcome to Exploring the Build. If you just found this place, then welcome, and if you're returning, I'm glad to have you back. I'm Alex, and this is my channel where we explore and theorycraft different character builds for Dungeons & Dragons, usually, but today we are going back and looking at Daggerheart. Daggerheart is a new RPG system currently in open beta from the creators of Critical Role, and we're going through a little mini-series where we are trying to create some character builds for the open beta rules in order to really stress test the limits of the system and see just what we can do in it. While this isn't meant to be a direct comparison to D&D, we're not necessarily theory crafting characters in the name of actually playing through with a full campaign. We are exploring the rules of the system through character building itself. So sure enough, Daggerheart did have a rules update recently, and it is now in version 1.3. Like I said in the Hope Bard that we did, the rules are all subject to change, and they certainly have. I had sort of worked out a build for this video prior to the 1.3 update, but now we're going to go through a completely fresh build with 1.3 instead of the outdated 1.2 version. There has been a significant change to the rules that actually affects the build that we were going to do for the video. The Hope Bard we had built was in 1.2, and the playtest I did with Insight Check and D&D Unoptimized a few weeks back was also using the 1.2 rule set, but now with 1.3 it's time to sort of re-explore what has been changed and also touch on some rules that we hadn't fully touched on in the 1.2 Hope Bard video. In terms of the rules I'm going to be mainly covering in this video, we're looking a lot at the defenses for the build. So I'll be examining things like evasion, armor, damage thresholds, and health. And when we are covering rules that have changed from 1.2 to 1.3, I'll be sure to sort of touch on what they used to be and what they are now and why that has affected the way our character build works. But if you wanted a full breakdown of the Daggerheart rules and how they changed, specifically looking at defenses and damage thresholds, of course, I would really recommend Insight Check's video from about a couple weeks back, where he did an in-depth look at the armor system in Daggerheart. With all that said, we have a lot of ground to cover in this video with the defenses and how they've changed, so let's jump right into the build. Okay, so today we are back on demi-plane to create our next Daggerheart character, and as always, we're starting with just our character name. We're going to be skipping over things like the experiences and other background and backstory choices that are more for the storytelling and narrative aspects of the game. It's not that we don't care about them, it's just that they're not too important for theory crafting to see how the rule systems work. So with that, we'll go ahead and name this character after our build, being a Thorns Guardian. So now that we know that we are going to be a Thorns Guardian, let's look at exactly what that means. To start with, we have to pick our class, and we are of course going to go with the Guardian class since that's what this is built for. And realistically, if you were just looking for a generic Thorns or Retaliation build, there are a couple different classes that work, but the Guardian really stands out because it gets multiple abilities that provide that type of playstyle. For picking the Guardian, we can see that our starting evasion score is 6, which is relatively low because we are meant to be a tankier class. That is a little bit easier to hit, but we're basically better at taking a hit because we have higher damage thresholds. So we now have to pick our subclass. There is Stalwart and Vengeance. Stalwart is the more defensive, tank-oriented option, whereas Vengeance is still a defensive subclass since the Guardian itself is built to be more of a reactive and defense-based class. But Vengeance is more damage-oriented. Its ability says that when we are hit by an enemy in melee range, and we have to mark at least one armor slot to reduce the damage, we can immediately roll a number of d6 equal to the number of armor slots we marked, and deal that enemy that much physical damage. Also, when we take this foundation, we gain an additional armor slot immediately. We'll go into why that's important, probably once we look at the overall character sheet, so we can have a visual representation of what armor slots really mean. After we've selected our subclass, it's time to set our traits. Traits are basically your ability scores in D&D 5e, only for us, we're specifically looking at modifiers just because of how the numbers work in Daggerheart. I'm going to go ahead and use the suggested traits. One thing to note for the Guardian specifically is that Strength is the trait that the Guardian favors the most. It is their primary ability for how they would build their characters and how a lot of domain cards interact with their ability. But agility is also almost just as important because agility determines mobility in Daggerheart. If ever you want to do the equivalent of a dash action, which is move from where you're standing to something within far range, that requires you to make an agility roll. And if you fail that roll, then you're probably not making it the full distance, meaning that we want to have a higher agility to be better at dashing and moving around the battlefield. After we've selected our traits, we're going to skip over choosing our starting weapons and armor, because we'll probably come back to those after we've picked up our domain deck cards. We'll also skip over the starting inventory because it's not too important for us right now. Looking at the domain deck cards available to us, we can see that right away there are 3 Valor and 3 Blade. Same thing as pretty much every other class in Daggerheart, you get 3 starting cards from each domain that your class has. Right away we can see that there's a Blade card that is literally called Retaliation, and we are definitely going to pick that. The Retaliation ability says that when we take damage from a creature in melee range, we can mark a stress to immediately deal weapon damage to the creature at half proficiency rounded up. That's important because proficiency does not work the same way it does in Daggerheart as the way it does in D&D 5e. In D&D 5e, proficiency is largely just a number modifier that you add to anything that you have proficiency in. Proficiency in Daggerheart is largely tied to damage. When you roll damage for a weapon, you roll a number of that weapon's damage dice equal to your proficiency. If the weapon does a d8, you roll 1d8. If it does a d10, you roll 1d10, at least at level 1 when your proficiency is 1. If your proficiency increases to 2, you'll roll 2d whatever it is that your weapon deals. Now if we wanted some more offensive options, then things like Not Good Enough, Whirlwind, and Valor's Forceful Push are all pretty good options. If we wanted a more defensive ability, something like I Am Your Shield, which allows us to actually tank hits for our allies, could also be a really good option. The reason I'm not going to take it right now though, is because it causes us to mark an additional stress. Normally it would be a pretty good idea when you're building a Thorns character to take abilities that let you take hits for other characters that are nearby. But because of how stress works in Daggerheart, which I'm not going to go in depth to it, but essentially you can think of it as like a stamina bar, we don't want that stamina bar filling up too quickly because we want to use our Retaliate card, which also uses stress, as many times as possible. That leaves us with one last card, which is Bare Bones. We're going to go ahead and select it, but looking at what it does, it says that as long as this card is in our loadout, if we choose not to equip armor, we have an armor score equal to 3 plus our level. So now it's time to get into the nitty-gritty of how armor works and how it changed from 1.2 to 1.3. Looking at starting armor, we see we have 4 choices to pick from, and we see that chainmail is suggested for the Guardian to take. Now, right away, I want to address what the change was between armor in 1.2 to 1.3, and that is a reduction in armor score. Armor score, again, I'll talk about it more when we have the character sheet available so we can see a sort of visual representation. But basically, armor score, or armor rating, as it is also sometimes referred to in the Daggerheart rules, is damage reduction. If we get hit, we can choose to spend an armor slot in order to reduce damage by our armor score. The heavier the armor, the higher the armor score. That makes sense. In 1.2, the armor score was higher, but we had less armor slots. In 1.3, now our armor score is lower, but we have more armor slots. So right away, that's a pretty simple change. But the other thing that was changed is that there was, at one point, a cost curve to armor score compared to evasion. And there still sort of is, but it's less apparent. Evasion is essentially armor class from D&D 5e. An enemy will roll against your evasion to determine if they even hit you, and then armor comes into play afterwards. In 1.2, the breastplate was the standard armor. It gave you an armor rating of 5, and it had no bonus to evasion or penalty to evasion. If you went down to leather armor, you had an armor rating of 3, and you got a bonus to evasion. If you went up to chainmail, your armor rating increased to 7, and you had a penalty of -1 evasion. Essentially, it was 1 evasion was worth 2 armor rating. In 1.3, we can see that that is not the case. Assuming that the breastplate is still meant to be the standard armor across the board for all classes, it has an armor rating of 3, and it doesn't have a penalty to evasion, but it does have a penalty to agility. If we go up to chainmail, which has an armor rating of 4, we're now gaining 1 armor rating, but we're trading our agility penalty for an evasion penalty. If we now go up to full plate armor with an armor rating of 5, we now keep that -1 evasion, but we bring back the penalty to agility. And finally, we can see that if we go down and lose 1 armor score with leather armor, we just have no penalty at all. So really, we can see that this cost curve changed from 1 evasion equaling 2 armor rating to a ratio of 1 to 1.5. It's not exactly correct, but that's at least how I'm thinking of it. Assuming this pattern were to continue, we would then have an armor with an armor rating of 7, and a -2 to evasion, -1 to agility, and so on and so forth. Right away, I'm going to admit I do not like that cost curve as much as I like the one in 1.2. In 1.2, the benefit of leather armor was that you could increase your evasion and have more of a dodge-oriented character who's just meant to not get hit. In 1.3, looking at leather armor specifically, it is disheartening to see that the designers have gone with the philosophy of, well, the bonus of this armor is that it doesn't have a penalty. And if you want to wear heavier armor than that, you just have to trade off the penalty you're taking. Meanwhile, if you wanted to go and use leather armor, instead of it providing a bonus to make you more of a dodge-oriented character like it used to do, it now just doesn't do anything, and just has the weakest armor score, but you're not suffering a penalty. It's an odd design choice and one that I don't necessarily agree with. He, of course, took the Bare Bones domain card, which, as it had said on the Bare Bones card, gave us an armor rating of 3 plus our level. That means that its armor score is 4, which is the equivalent of chainmail, and it doesn't have the penalty. I can't help but think that the Bare Bones card, which gives us an armor score that's going to scale pretty well with our level, is anything but infinitely better than the armor options given to us at character creation, especially when we eventually go and look at damage thresholds. For our weapons, we'll quickly pick 2 that work really well for us. It's just a battle axe, but a battle axe is two-handed, and I'm not too interested in a two-handed weapon right now. What I will take instead is a hallowed axe, because it is a one-handed weapon that deals 1d10 plus 1 magic damage, which is pretty good. So we're going to select that. And then for our secondary weapon, we're going to pick a paired weapon, essentially becoming a dual wielder. It doesn't really matter right now whether we pick saber or small dagger, so I'll say we just pick small dagger for right now, because all that we really care about is the fact that as long as we have this weapon in our offhand, we gain +2 to the damage of our primary weapon when we're in melee. Now that we've figured out pretty much what our character has in terms of their class, their domains, and their weapons, it's time to look at what they can actually do. To just get it out of the way really quick, we'll see that we have Retaliation here, which allows us to, like it says, spend a stress in order to deal weapon damage back, which is a d10 plus 3. That is our Hallowed Axe, plus our small dagger providing an extra 2 damage to that main attack. We can then see that with the Vengeance subclass of Guardian, when we are hit by an enemy in melee range, as long as we're marking armor slots, we can roll a number of d6 equal to the number of armor slots marked, and deal the enemy that much physical damage as well, assuming they're still in melee. That means if we do get hit while in melee, we're dealing back 1d10 plus 3 plus however many armor slots worth of d6 that we have marked. That can be quite potent, especially when you consider just how damage thresholds work in Daggerheart. To start with, let's talk about the damage thresholds. We can see that there is this nice little threshold line here, where it starts at 1, goes up to 9 for major, and 18 to severe. But what does that actually mean? When we take any amount of damage in Daggerheart, let's say we're taking 16, that number is then going to be compared to this threshold line. 16 is above 9, but below 18, so it fits in our major threshold, meaning right away we're going to be taking 2 hit points of damage. After we've determined where the damage lies, we then have the choice to spend armor slots. For every armor slot spent, we then reduce the damage by our armor rating. So for us that is 4, meaning if we spend 1, we reduce the damage down by 4, 8, 12, and so on. This can help us take either smaller amounts of damage or potentially nothing if we reduce the damage down below our minor threshold. It used to be that in 1.2, our minor threshold was a little bit higher, and if we took damage under it, we would suffer stress as part of that damage. But because that really drains your ability, since stress is supposed to be like a stamina bar, the designers decided to change that in 1.3 and just make it so that anything under your minor threshold, which is pretty much 1 for all classes, instead gets nullified. Now, because of how the thresholds work in Daggerheart, there is an odd, unintuitive phenomenon with how they interact with armor. This was pointed out in Insight Check on his video about damage thresholds and armor, and of course the flaws with this system. But essentially the gist of it is that the closer together your thresholds are, the easier it is to reduce damage down from severe to major to potentially even minor. This makes most armor, but especially heavy armor, more efficient for what would be considered squishy classes, like wizards, who have lower thresholds overall, but also thresholds that are closer together. On the other hand, a tankier class like our Guardian has higher thresholds, making it a lot tougher for enemies to really hurt us, but it also makes our armor a lot less efficient. The efficiency usually falls off after you get into really high amounts of damage that are well above your severe threshold, but for middling ranges of damage, it's effectively equal for us to wear either lighter armor like a breastplate or chainmail as it is to wear plate armor. We didn't really take that too much into consideration because we took bare bones, but that's the reason bare bones is so good. Sure, we're not getting as nice of an armor rating as we could if we wore plate mail, but we're not taking the penalties of the plate mail anyways, and we're going to get about the same efficiency in those odd spots where the efficiency of heavy armor falls off for us because we have such high damage thresholds. Because we know that that odd efficiency exists, and that for us, having higher thresholds means that we're going to want to be using multiple armor slots anyways, we know that this actually, inadvertently, pairs really well with our Vengeance ability. If we're taking those middling points of damage, and we know that we have to spend 2 armor slots to get it into the minor threshold anyways, because we know we have to use those 2 armor slots, that means we're getting 2d6 just for trying to avoid 2 points of damage. This is another sort of odd efficiency curve specifically for the Vengeance Guardian, where the inefficiency of armor benefits us because we have to mark those armor slots anyways if we don't want to take as much damage, and marking more armor slots means dealing more damage. If the enemy is in melee, of course. Alright, so that was pretty much our entire Retaliate Guardian from Daggerheart. Hopefully you can see how we could build that character to really optimize around the oddly inefficient armor/damage threshold system that exists in order to get a little bit more damage output off of our turn in Daggerheart combat. There was a lot to talk about, and I hoped I touched on enough that it made sense. Overall, let me know your thoughts on the build, or what you might do or change to sort of get it to work a little bit differently in Daggerheart, or even just how you feel about the defense rules in the Daggerheart system as a whole, whether that's thresholds, armor rating, armor score, evasion, all of it together. For someone who likes crunching numbers like me, I think it's a pretty interesting system, but whether or not it fits in Daggerheart is an entirely different argument altogether. Thank you so much for coming on the journey with me, and I hope to see you in the next one.